Welcome to the Maintainable Software Podcast, where we explore the art of improving existing software with seasoned practitioners who have helped organizations work past the problems often associated with technical debt and legacy code. I'm your host, Robby Russell. On this episode, our guest is Gene Young, who joins us today from the California Bay Area, my old stomping grounds in the United States. Gene is the founder and CEO of Akita Software. Prior to that, they were an assistant professor at the computer science department at Carnegie Mellon and worked on their PhD at MIT. Gene Young, we're so glad to have you join us on Maintainable. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. This is super exciting.
So as you reflect on your experience in the industry, what do you believe are a few common characteristics of, dare I say, well-maintained software?
Well, so I think one thing I would like to say is I used to think that all well-maintained software should have similar characteristics, good documentation, modular, all this stuff. And one thing I've come to realize over the years is that not all software was meant to be maintainable, and that is okay. I used to judge code pretty hard for not having the qualities of maintainable software. One important thing is to really be honest with oneself about how maintainable the software is intended to be and indicating that. And I think that, in the space of intended to be well-maintained software, it's the usual suspects. But outside of that, I think there's a ton of software that, as long as it's honest with itself that it wasn't meant to be long-lived or it wasn't meant to be used at a certain scale, it deserves to exist too.
Am I to interpret that in that you might be a fan of a rewrite at some point if a piece of software it maybe breaks the original agreement it had with itself or the team had about it, like what they were trying to approach with the software? If you're like, this isn't supposed to scale, this is for now. Where's that kind of distinction there for you?
Yeah, I am another startup, couple stages ahead of us, who was really disciplined about rewriting their code every 6 months. So they wrote prototypes that weren't meant to be maintainable, and they were really disciplined about throwing out code. And I think most people are not so disciplined, but I really like that model as even just a point in the thought space that it exists. Because I think some people are just so afraid to write code that isn't intended to be maintainable because they're just like, no one throws stuff out. And I'm like, that startup did. We throw stuff out. We've done rewrites in our company. I think that rewrites when you're small and early is, it doesn't take that long in the grand scheme of how much time you're going to take maintaining that unmaintainable thing. And so, yeah, I think that prototypes that are meant to be prototypes are a great thing too.
Now, if I understand that, because if it's like the intention is that they're not going to be maintained for a long time, are there trade-offs that those teams are then able to make? Like, would you advocate for like, well, we don't need to worry about writing automated tests or something of that? Or is it more of like...
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think that, most seed stage startups I know don't have automated tests. In fact, I did a Twitter thread the other day about how most software teams in the wild don't have the kind of practices that developer influencers talk about. I think most teams don't have the tests that you're supposed to have. And whenever I've dug into it, it's made a lot of sense. Either, the code started out being a prototype and then it evolved beyond what it was supposed to do, or it was legacy, never had tests. There's a variety of reasons. And I think that the goal of a piece of software evolves so much from first prototype to something that's supposed to scale that something that was well maintained in the beginning, what does that even mean? It's a completely different beast. And I think that here's another controversial point of view I have, I guess, which is that setting software up to be maintainable can sometimes hide the fact that that software was never intended to be maintained for this new purpose that the software is now being used for. And maybe people should be more honest with themselves about that.
It's interesting take there. I'm cringing a little bit, but I'm also trying to in a way of being like, because I work on software that's usually been built many, many years before. And so I don't usually get to be part of those. I intentionally avoid being part of the early stage of projects because that part of, to me, is like the chaotic side, part of the process where companies are trying to figure out where they're going to be and who they want to grow up to be and stuff like that. And so I just get to deal with like the long-term ramifications of them not rewriting or not figuring some of the stuff down early on, because I also understand and I'm empathetic to teams that like you have to make those trade-offs because you don't even know if this product's going to find a good fit in the market and you're going to have customers and, is it going to pay for itself? And so you can keep evolving it or adding new software into your technology stack.
Yeah. And I think it's, even especially the growth stage of these companies, I would say is where like a bunch of stuff goes down, right? Because if you think about it, software was initially built for something. You're all of a sudden extending it with all these new features. Your database needs to scale in a way that it wasn't intended to scale before. The way you're moving data around all of a sudden needs to scale in a way that it wasn't intended before. You had set up your processes for, maybe like a few dozen people team, you're 7xing, 10xing your number of people. In that kind of environment, like what is maintainability is even, is I would say up for definition.
Do you often use the metaphor technical debt to describe things with your customers or within your team?
Our team consciously takes on tech debt. We don't really use that term explicitly a lot. I think we all know what we're talking about most of the time. Like, hey, we're going to, here are the judicious shortcuts we're going to take. This is what we're going to do. We're pretty aware of, we have just been 2xing our database size instead of implementing certain practices because we're like, look, we thought about the trade-offs and this is going to take this amount of time. It's not going to be a problem until, about 3 months from now. We're going to revisit this 2 months from now. I think that it's really interesting to hear your side of things, Robby, because I think that I used to also be mostly looking from the other side, like, oh, there's like these like piles of code. I'm like doing archaeology. Why is this way? But then when you start at the early stages and you're looking at how people are doing their software processes, 1, 2, 3, 4 stages later, it makes complete sense that the code ended up in the way it did, because it wasn't a linear path to getting there at all. And I think even people who are, make the most judicious tech debt trade-offs end up, like, you just don't know where you're going, right? And so you can't take a straight path to the final code base at all.
No, it kind of just happens, or maybe it's organic, and I think that's an okay thing as well. Do you as you reflect back on earlier parts of your career, do you feel like you use the metaphor technical debt or work with people that you felt like in retrospect was kind of that you were talking about it maybe the wrong way or have misconceptions about it and would label things as technical debt maybe you would disagree with?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I come from an academic programming languages background. I got my PhD in programming languages. I was a professor working in programming languages. I was publishing in programming languages conferences. And I think that the assumption that a lot of us made was that tech debt is bad and should be reduced at all costs. I've come to see it as, it's something you trade off with other kinds of debt. It's, optimizing your system to be the most streamlined technical system is going to be at the cost of many, many, many other things. It's going to be at the cost of your human processes. It's going to be at the cost of your business processes. It's going to be at the cost of, the sanity of your engineers in some senses. And so I think that a lot of us who came from a academic programming languages background or an academic software engineering background, how we were trained was like, this is tech debt. Recognize it. It's bad. Here are all the practices we're going to put in place to reduce it. If you ever see, A, B, C, or D, like send alarms. We have a few of us programming languages PhDs on our team. And I think like within like 1 week of understanding the landscape of decisions that we had to make regarding the software, it's like, all right, we have to build the software for one of 10 options now. We don't know what any of them are. And the software only has to be this good. And I think that in the beginning, people are like, oh yeah, we're going to reduce tech debt whenever necessary. And at some point we're just like, no, the trade-off space is so much more complex than that.
And I don't think you're advocating for not removing technical debt, right? Just make that clear for the audience.
I'm not advocating for taking on unnecessary technical debt. It's another dimension of the trade-off space, especially. Well, I think that at all points, I think that there are people who like to talk about software will say, there's a time and a place to reduce tech debt. And from watching software teams of all stages, and so our users tend to be much later stage. A lot of our the users that we come across, they have multi-decade old code bases, and they're saddled with the tech debt choices of the past. And for them, it's also not the time to reduce tech debt because of how it trades off with their current engineering staff or the current business decisions or things like that. And so I think that tech debt is one of those things. It's always going to be there. How you choose, it's I had a friend tell me once their favorite comic book artist said that there's always an additional character in your comics. So for children, it's the environment. You're always, they interacting, learning, playing with the environment. And for adults, it's their emotional baggage of the past. And I think for software teams, the additional character is always tech debt. You can treat tech debt as, just like the family member that's always there. You can treat tech debt as the villain, but it's a permanent character.
That's an interesting way to think about it. And well, do we have to invite them over for dinner? But they're coming over for Thanksgiving. Okay, we'll just...
Yeah, are they coming anyway? What kind of seat do we give them to mitigate the blast radius of when they implode? Wow,
that's I'm gonna have to ponder that one for a bit. Something you said a little bit ago as well, as you'd mentioned developer influencers. How would you define a developer influencer? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I sort of just made up that term when I did the tweet thread because I had to describe, this is who people are listening to in the developer world. I think there's a few dimensions of it. I think that to me, who I would consider developer influencers, Rob Pike, the now canceled Richard Stallman, a lot of the Bell Labs people. But those are the old school influencers. They wrote a lot of foundational software. They wrote a lot about the software. Their writings on the various mailing lists and now the Google groups are people know them. I think there's also the modern versions of that. I think the creators of Julia, the creators of Elixir, the creators of the languages that people know and love are somewhat influencers. I think these communities have their own influencers, people who are contributors or big users of them who write a lot, blog a lot. I had this Twitter thread where I talked about what the developer influencers talk about is different than what the people do. And I think that people thought that what I meant was developer advocates or people who are paid to represent companies. And I think influencers often do get hired into these companies. And they do have influence, but I would say if I look at spheres of influence among my developer friends, it's still, the main contributors or the main builders in a community and not as much the people who are hired to market for some of these tools, although it sometimes overlaps.
So when you're saying that their approach and developer influencers, do you think, and you're saying it's kind of a disconnected from what maybe I'm air quoting what real software teams and processes actually look like? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously I have a skewed view of this because I live in Silicon Valley. We took venture funding from some, reputable venture capital firms. And when I first moved out here, the discourse was, what's Amazon doing? What's LinkedIn doing? What did Facebook do here? When I talked about, this is the kind of infra that I think we should have. This is what I think people should do. And then when it comes to adoption, people ask, how many Silicon Valley unicorns are adopting this? And what we were finding was a lot of our early signups were companies outside of California, companies outside of the coasts, companies not in America. And they were showing up and they were telling us the problems they had with the software that had been brought up this way. They said, look, it doesn't address this need, that need, all these different needs we have. And for the first couple of years, I was just like, oh, I guess we're not cool, because one of my investors, went down our user list and they're like, all right, these are your influencers. And then these are just other people. Because, there is like a currency of influence in Silicon Valley. And for a while, I was just like, man, somehow our center of gravity is off or something. And then my aha moment was, wait a minute, the people who have the processes from the Facebook and the Googles who are paying attention to what the Facebooks and the Googles are doing, that's such a small fraction of the total mass of software development. That's such a small fraction of the mind share. And it took me a while to realize, because when I looked at what was being spoken about at conferences, what people were blogging about, it all matched this like trickle down assumption of software process. And people were actually pretty embarrassed to tell me their their actual processes, because I would show up. So Akita, my company, is an observability company. I would show up and I would say, hey, we're doing this stuff. What observability do you have in place? And people would say, oh yeah, we use open telemetry, and we're using Lightstep, or we're using Honeycomb. And then we don't have these kinds of needs that you're talking about. And then we would get to the end of the meeting and they'd be like, oh, you're right. I would ask a few follow-up questions like, hey, so these modern processes that you talk about, how many services are those installed in? Or, how often are these being engaged or deployed? And the real answer was always something different. And something else we found too was in the beginning, I don't really have product management or user research experience. So I just asked questions how I thought you should ask them, which was like, what do you want me to build you? I quickly realized that the things the developers are asking for were so far off from what they ended up using. And at first I was like, what's going on? Why? And what I realized was they have this notion in their head, especially if they're talking to other developers on the outside, like, oh yeah, we have great tests, or oh yeah, we're totally there on our X migration. And then the reality was they were much earlier in the migration. They're much earlier in the modernization of their processes. And it actually just didn't make sense for them to test to the insane degree that some of the people who blog about it. I mean, a side tangent is I went to an all-girls school, and people probably hear a lot about young girls get blasted with body image things. Photoshop is bad. Like there's like impossible beauty standards. There's impossible everything standards. You have influencers saying, I wake up at 4 a.m. I beautify myself for only 20 minutes, then I look like this. And so actually, we had a lot of assemblies when I was in school of sociology researchers and things like that telling us, don't listen to this. This is not true. And they would actually deconstruct Photoshop for us. And I had this kind of very similar moment with developers where I was like, oh my gosh, this is the exact same thing going on. Like, these people are embarrassed to tell me this is these are our real processes. Like, it would take a while for them to tell us. It would be maybe 3 months of me waiting for them to adopt the feature they requested when they were not adopting it at all. And then wondering why to actually have this realization that, and this is why I call it, quote unquote, real software process. Because it's the same thing where you have people talking about these idealistic, very beautiful, very nice things. And no one I was encountering was doing them, and no one was talking about it.
We'll be back with our interview with Gene in just a moment. Hi, it's me, Robby. I just wanted to take a quick moment to say thank you for making time to listen to the Maintainable Software podcast. If you're finding these discussions valuable, please take a moment to consider sharing a link amongst your peers and or writing a review on Apple Podcasts to help spread the word. Also, do you know someone I should be interviewing on Maintainable? Shoot me an email to Robby with a Y at maintainable.fm. And now, let's get back to our interview with Gene Young. One of my goals with this podcast and having these conversations was to ask very similar questions to a lot of different people, so people can hear the wide variety and how we're all not in unison. And I know a lot of people, especially if they're working at smaller companies, they look up to like, well, who can afford the time to talk about how they're actually doing things or how they're aiming to do things differently. And then when every conference benefits from having speakers that are going to be from a large reputable company, because that helps probably gets more people in chairs or attending an online webinar or something like, oh, what are they doing at Amazon versus some company you've never heard of before, right? And you're like, well, I don't know what kind of challenges does that company have, that has like 10 developers versus the company that has 10,000 developers. But those are the teams that potentially have the bandwidth to talk about this stuff maybe a little bit more, have people in those roles that can do that. Or I as you were kind of talking about this a little bit, I thought a little bit about how my team's embarrassed about some of our workflow processes. I'm happy to admit that. But sometimes it also means that they're wondering if the grass is greener somewhere else. Like, well, we're not able to do what, I'm going to go work at some other company that has this shit figured out, and it's like, what? No.
Yeah, and they usually don't. Like every one of my friends who switched companies for process has been woefully disappointed. And also there's a thing where, the observation that really hit me very hard as I've been talking to software teams across the industry, starting my company, is if you're at an Amazon or an Uber, you have whole multiple teams to manage developer productivity. So you have like multiple testing teams. One team is responsible for like running test infrastructure. The other team is like responsible for texting that team when anything goes wrong with that infrastructure. So you have test teams for your test teams. And like, I think in the like beauty influencer world, that's the equivalent of, the influencer waking up, having a hair team, a makeup team, a nail team, people sending them $10,000 rings. You just can't wake up and look like that. Like it's not even so I think then they're like, oh yeah, just use this face cream and you can look like me. No, that's not true. They have people to do things for their people, So someone who had been at Uber retweeted my thread, and he said, when I was at Uber, there was a whole team responsible for monitoring my team who was responsible for writing tests. You just don't have that most places. And so I'll bring this back to the observability space, which we're in. A lot of the teams we encounter, they do not have whole observability teams. They do not have developer productivity teams. They don't have tools teams. And even one of the companies, I'm working on a blog post with them, I had put, like the sentence, oh yeah, we didn't have a developer productivity team to do this for us. And he's like, who do we think we are even writing that sentence? Like, that's not who we are. And so I think that on the one hand, sure, like if you look at, your average AWS developer, their processes look pretty good because they're waking up and just doing some stuff. But there's like 15 teams working full time to support that. And that's just not most software shops.
Do you think, for those listening that might be like, well, maybe there is like these panacea places I can go to where I can get, so do you think the people that are in those teams probably feel a better sense of fulfillment as a software engineer because they're part of a team that can afford, or an organization that can afford to have all those things in place? Or what's been your take on that?
I think it really depends on what you want. So I've worked at Google, I've worked at Facebook, I've worked at Microsoft Research. And I will say, so I was at Google in 2007. The software process was pretty great. Like we had, all the code that got checked in was beautiful. You would not see any example of strings being passed by reference in there. I was writing in C++. Everything was spaced exactly right. Everything was, they like, this was, enough years into Google that they had gotten their process down. And I don't know, like if it's devolved since then, but there was a process in place. And so, sure, that was beautiful, but I also didn't go to, I never went back to Google actually, because I was like, I'm one of like how many thousand developers at this point. And so that, like, I just felt like, my, like the marginal benefit of me passing in my pristine, like 4 spaces in, no overhanging arguments off the line, like all that code. Like, I'm just like, look, like, I don't really feel like I'm making a big impact here, right? Like, I'm just part of the machine. And so I think that, there's trade-offs. Like, I like sometimes I envy people who can be happy in a situation like that, because that was great process. But I think there are trade-offs, because I think that as big as Google is, they only take so many developers. So there are developers to whom like that's not accessible. And then there are developers for whom that is an accessible option who are just like, look, like that's too many developers. Like I don't want to be part of that. And I will say like when I worked at Facebook, I think Google had put insane discipline into all their processes, and I have never seen that at another company that I have been at or interviewed with or interviewed for like user stuff. But it exists. I will admit that too many years at Google for us as a startup now is a bit of a hiring red flag because we're like, someone who has existed for so long in such a world, like, are they even fit for the external world anymore? I think that, there are trade-offs. There are places that, just as there are influencers whose actual lives are wake up, hair team, nail team, makeup team, clothes team, like, there are people out there, but do you want that to be your life? I think is another question. Most like there are many people who could be influencers who are not.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. So let's talk a little bit more about Akita Software. Can you provide the audience with an overview of what problems you've set out to build solutions for?
Sure, absolutely. So our goal is one-click observability, and our one investor describes it as no code for observability, and here's what I mean. So software is getting more complex. This is part of the reason Robby has this podcast. But, most software systems are these heterogeneous, organically evolved piles of hot mess. And so like some of them inevitably became this way due to existing for a long time. So just like the number of tools that, have passed through the software industry once you've been around for 10, 20 years is just insane. And so sometimes, the heterogeneity is inevitable. I think that the rise of APIs, the rise of microservices, and the rise of things like no code and low code have contributed to this as well, because previously, it took, maybe a decade for a software system to really become heterogeneous and really complex and hard to deal with. And today it's, you boot something up, you call a few APIs, and there you go. You've got a distributed system. It's heterogeneous. It's hard to reason about. In comes the entire observability space, which has become a bit of a buzzword by now. And a lot of people will tell you that the three pillars of observability are logs, metrics, and traces. So they'll say, look, like you got your logging, you always have to log. You want metrics because you want to know if your system's falling down, and then you want to trace because you want to know like how stuff is flowing around. I have a blog post where I say, well, that's great and all, but that's kind of like saying programming is about manipulating assembly instructions. There's really like a higher level thing you're trying to do with programming here. And I think the higher level goal of observability is to understand your software systems and to have models for understanding them. And right now, developers they're consuming logs, metrics, and traces to build those models in their head. And so one of the motivations for us is like, okay, how can we make it easier for programmers to build those models? And there are two things we're going after. One is we're setting out to be a drop-in solution. So we don't necessarily need to be a power tool. So a lot of these observability tools, they're like, all right, instrument your code, do all this stuff to your code, and then you can get like better logs, metrics, and traces. And we're like, nope, we want to be like a B+ on day one kind of solution. So we've been going at it with, can we just drop in, listen to network traffic, and do something? And so the other part is, well, if you just showed everyone all of their network traffic, you're no better than Wireshark. They're going to be like, oh my gosh, like what am I supposed to do with all this? And so the other part we do is we model that network traffic in a way that is understandable. And so we do what we call API-centric observability. We infer API endpoint structure. We infer data types. We infer how endpoints are talking to each other. We infer the shape of the service graph. And so for us, that's a step towards abstracting over logs, metrics, and traces. We don't think that's the end of everything. I think, what I would love to see in observability is like you abstract over that with like, this is how your services are interacting. This is how the thing above the services are interacting. Software is only becoming more complex. But right now, what you can do with Akita is drop us in. We use a subset of eBPF. So we use PCAP to listen to network traffic. We will give you your service graph. We'll give you automated tracing. So like if one endpoint is slow, we'll give you this is the breakdown, here are counts, latencies across your endpoints. And then we'll give you what you can export as an API spec. This is your API. These are the data formats. You can search it. You can do a bunch of stuff. We're not done. This is why we're still in beta. But where we'd like to go is essentially if a company has no observability in place and they don't have the bandwidth to instrument, or their code is too legacy to instrument, or, that they don't know what they have, they can drop us into something that they're pretty scared to touch otherwise. We can give them, logs, metrics, basic traces, and eventually more.
It's interesting. You mentioned like an output being API specs. How does that compare to a team maintaining their own, say, documentation for an API?
Oh, that's a great question. So we actually initially got into this whole thing because we wanted to build tooling that assumed people had API specs. We're like, oh yeah, we'll build you some, testing tools, fuzzing tools. Just give us an API spec. And people were like, BRB. And that was, I think, my first taste of people don't want to tell you they don't have an API spec, or they don't want to tell you how not up to date their API spec is. But the percentage of teams we encountered, and this, obviously there's sample bias here, but the teams we encountered that did not have this was high enough that we had to shift into doing this full time. If that gives you any evidence of how that went down. I think that there's a lot of great literature. There's a lot of great ideology. There's a lot of great philosophy around spec first, API first, write down an API. And I've been going around the API specs community giving talks about, well, I think we should shift to API in the loop, because expecting people to know what their API is upfront is actually it's not practical for a variety of reasons, because even if you sit down, write your whole API up front, that changes even as you develop. And then your API is probably based on a service that calls other APIs. And then once you actually run that in prod, your understanding of the contract that your API upholds is going to change, because like that thing is not just like, it's not shrink wrap software anymore, right? Like it's a living, breathing thing interacting with other things, being interacted with programmatically. And so the number of ways that will differ from the original spec is just so much greater than any spec that was previously written in history. And like, let's be honest, previously written historical specs were never that great or as great as we hoped to begin with.
It's true. I always think about there's always that fun challenge. Think of how many projects we've had this happen on for ourselves, where we're building out something and we're either needing to build out an API or some other vendor is building out an API, and we have to integrate together at some point, right? And like, in order for this all to come together, we all have to so we have to sit down and like spec it out together, and like, this is the agreement we have. And then of course, like, as you get closer and closer to like, you're like, nope, we need to make changes. And then you have to make a bunch of weird trade-offs, and like, you're not using it the way you said you would use it. And it becomes a big mess. And then so other teams, like we've worked on projects where they're like, oh yeah, we've got great documentation. They'll sell our clients on their platform. And then when we actually get the documentation, it's like, here's a old Word doc that's outdated that I'm like, this isn't actually, the endpoints don't match at all. I'm like, so when we end up giving them kind of like here's actually how your API works now. We'll update that for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, people describe it as like, oh, it was this one-off situation, what a mess. But then when I talk to people about, okay, tell me about another time, same thing. And so this is what I mean by, this quote unquote real software process. Like, it's so different than what people want it to be. It's so different than what people admit that it is, but it just is. We started out with just giving people, we saw your traffic, here's your spec. And they were like, but this is so many more endpoints than I thought we had. And so this is we were going after mapping out the graph the whole time, but part of the monitoring was we had to tell them which endpoints to pay attention to, because they were like, what? We only documented like 3-5 endpoints, and like, this is like 35 endpoints over here. Do they even get used? And so yeah, I think that one other thing is not even it's not even, people idolize people at certain companies. It's even people at those companies. Software developers, when they're told to speak about something that is rough, is messy, they'll idealize it, and other software developers want to hear that. So there's this, it's human nature across all influencings.
It's interesting, the idea that we're always trying to, like, maybe in some ways project our best ideal version of ourselves in some ways, and companies do that as well. And I can imagine it be a very, thinking about it as someone, I know that you're like actively recruiting right now as well, and it's like how successful can teams be if they're like, well, we have a huge hot shitty mess on our hand, and like, please come in and like help save the day. But it's like, no, come in, learn how to work around all the things the way that we do, and maybe you'll make you'll come help make more of a mess with us, is maybe not the best recruitment strategy, but it's maybe honest.
Yeah, I think that, I think we're probably all still trying to figure out how to pitch it. I think for us, I'll do a whole anti-sell, not just with the software process, but the general process, where I'm like, look, you're joining an early stage startup. What this means is like, how much work there is in a week depends on a lot of external factors. It's hard to predict. We have to consciously take on tech debt sometimes. If you want to write pristine software on timelines that are on your terms, like, this is not the place for you. And I think that a lot of people end up concluding that they don't want to be in the places that write pristine software, because that moves really slow. Like, it's not just you writing pristine software on that timeline, it's everybody else. And so I think that, either you're writing rocket ship software, and so like you launch once every 10 years or something, or the company is just moving very slow for other purposes, inexplicably. So yeah, I think, a lot of people want to be where the action is, and where the action is messy, is real, there's a lot of other stuff happening.
Hi there. Do you know someone who might be looking for assistance with their Ruby on Rails application? Planet Argon would love to meet them. We're offering a $1,000 referral bonus. Send someone our way, and if they sign up for services with Planet Argon, we'll give them a $1,000 discount. And in return, you'll get a check for $1,000 in the mail, just for knowing the right person. Hop on over to planetargon.com/referrals for more information and to refer someone our way. That's planetargon.com/referrals. Thanks.
Out of curiosity, just as I know that you're recruiting right now, what types of roles are you currently hiring for?
Oh my gosh, many. So our team is really small. We're actually 4 people right now, and it's a very productive 4 people. I would say, like, we have kept it small on purpose, so that we're high communication, easily aligned, easily on the same page. And so we're looking for front end engineers. We're looking for back end engineers. We're looking for full stack product engineers, and we also have 2 roles that are not listed on our website. We're looking for a developer advocate, and we're looking for a product manager. And depending on seniority, maybe head of product, depends. I think for us, I think that sometimes people are like, well, if you're looking for so many people, like, why am I not a fit? Because like we have encountered many people who are like, look, I'm looking for a job, you're looking for people, let's do it. And I think that the thing that I've learned is at the early stage, we're looking for like a great fit, because when you're only 4 people, a 5th person is you're increasing your team by 25%. And especially if we don't want to take on even more tech debt, what we were looking for is someone who experience-wise complements our team. So we're like a back-end heavy team with experience in programming languages, networking systems, there are many different complements, but that's one thing. We have a huge gap in front end, but I think the right front end person to work with such a back end heavy team, I want someone who's gonna really stand up for front end needs, and really have like fun ideas to bring to bear on a dev tool. for product engineers, same, like people who are like, look, I'd have a ton of fun working on a dev tool. Like this is something I can totally get into, totally get obsessed with. And, that's really the same across all of our roles. So yeah, we have like more open positions than we have people on our team. But I think the three things I'm looking for is this someone really looking to like dig into something, get deep, they're okay with messiness. Two, is this someone who like they really are going to have a lot of fun getting a ton of stuff done in an environment where stuff is a hot mess some of the time, and that's okay. We know it. We did it on purpose. We talk about it, but it's not going to be any different. And then is this someone who they're a similar ambition level to us. Like they also want this kind of tool to exist. And so I think these are all pretty hand wavy, but we have we have found people where we're like, yep, that is someone we would like on our team, and so I'm hoping we can find more to bring onto our team in the near future.
Nice. I know it's a competitive market out there. I know as someone who hires people right now. So I'll definitely include a link to that to your jobs page in the show notes for everybody listening, so they can learn more about those roles. Taking a quick step back again on like tooling, I'm curious, I know that you've been doing a little bit of research. I know you've been around, I think you said on another podcast, you were around when the JavaScript pop-up was invented, and, thinking about software programming over the last several decades, do you think it's more or less complicated given the amount of third-party software like in tooling we have now that maybe we didn't have 10, 15 years ago? Do you think it's more or less complicated to understand the ecosystem of like what a software platform now encompasses? I think, and like, you mentioned earlier about it's like immediately all these like services come into play. Do you think it's hard for people to join this industry or easier?
It's way more complicated, but in some ways it's easier. So when I got started, until 2015, how I made a web page was I would open in Vim an empty file. I would open HTML, close HTML, and then I would include the packages. And I think that after 2015, it really became uncool to do that anymore because you're just denying yourself of everything that was out there. So 2015 is the last time I really did front end. But yeah, I think that when I got started, everything was like you open a blank file and you did some stuff, and you couldn't even imagine, getting like a mobile app up and running. And I judged a university hackathon a few years ago, and it was 48 hours, 72 hours, something like that. And by the end of it, people had these crazy apps. They hooked up to your bank account, and they give you all these alerts, and they give you these great visualizations, or they give you like you could do like which based on what cardinal direction you were facing, they played different music. And I was just like, whoa, there is no way in 48 hours when I was in college you could have done something like that in a hackathon, or you had to be the best programmer in the world times 2 or something, because there just was not so much stuff. And so I think that for people who are okay sitting in kind of a chaotic environment and just absorbing things from their environment, which young people these days seem to be very good at, there's just so much more you can do on day one of programming. Because when I learned to program, I'm like, all right, here's, basic, and let's write some line numbers now. Like, woohoo, I finally have a thing that shows like an ASCII rocket ship, and it sometimes crashes. You know what I mean? Like, and that took like hours. And so I think it's easier to get stuff done. I think it's harder to understand what's going on. And so I was a university professor for a couple of years. I don't think we're necessarily giving students the tools to really make sense of what's going on. Like, do they have a mental model of what's going on with all these APIs? I don't know that anybody knows how to think about it. So one of my internal motivations for why I'm doing an observability company is my view is like, look, if you can own people's observability tooling or some part of the stack, you can also start giving them like, here's your mental model for how to think about it, which I think is lacking these days. Because I feel like most of what people are taught in school is like, if you got to dictate everything from scratch, here's how to think about it. But like, what happens when it's this organically evolving ecosystem? I think it's just different now. And so yesterday I was talking about one of the programmers I idolized when I was younger, and I was like, there's for people who came up all you had was a blank page, there was a certain discipline, like your memory was so limited. The tools you had were so limited. If you could actually build big things with that was super like there's no selection function that selects for that today in programmers. But what, anyone can do on day one, and just like, if you're a good programmer, what you can do in like a year is just so much more than before that. Yeah, I think, this is probably a better world to live in, but harder in some ways.
I can understand that. And one of the things I'm always curious that you mentioned, like I'm the kind of software developer that I don't know that I'm like intentionally feel like it's okay for me not to understand how something works, because I'm like, well, I feel like I was able to interact with it. I kind of, at least I know what the ins and outs are of working with it, but I don't need to understand everything. And for that, I'm going to walk away from that. And like, maybe one day I'll come back and do a deeper dive into like how that thing that I'm working with within the software, and I'm trying to think of like a good example, but like whether it's an API or like, I created a thing called Oh My Z Shell, and I don't really understand how Z Shell works, being honest.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great example, because I think that like that is the exact skill set required to succeed today. And I think that a lot of the old school, like people who are really good back in the day, they were able to understand their entire system intricately. That's what allowed them to move fast. And it's a different skill set today, and I think different brain people are going to be good at it.
So a couple of quick last questions for you as we wrap things up. Is there a non-software development, non-technical book that you find yourself recommending to people on a regular basis?
Yeah, I'm obsessed with Judd Apatow's Stick in the Head. So Judd Apatow, as people may know, is, famous comedic director. Stick in the Head is a book where he interviews a lot of comics, from Chris Rock to Amy Schumer, Jerry Seinfeld. And I've always thought of my craft as very similar to stand-up comedy. So I think when I was in research, and also when you're in startups, a lot of what you're trying to do, there's like, I explain to people there's like three parts of an idea. There's the idea itself, there's the execution, and then there's the land. And before you try to land something, you don't know how all three parts are going to come together. I didn't understand for a long time why I really loved hearing comics talk about their craft. But for them too, there's the idea of, what's the joke you're going to tell? There's the execution, like how did you actually craft it? How did you do your timing? And then it's like, did it land or did you bomb? And until you do all three parts, you can't tell. The main way that both computer science research and early stage startups is different than engineering something where, like people have built this before, this is what they need, they want it, is you don't know how something turns out until it lands. And so like the more iterations you do, the more you just get up there and you workshop, the better things get. And so I think that it was really really enlightening for me to hear about how these comics approach that, how they deal with just it's very existentially threatening to have your like your craft, which is very tied up with your identity and all of that, be like to have to put yourself out there, not know how things are going to go, and have it be subject to like all these other forces and people and like things out of your control. And I just love that book. And I think even people who aren't in research or startups, it's just like it's a very inspiring book, I think.
Is it safe to assume that some of the takeaways from that would be that just because it didn't land the first few times, it doesn't mean you just give up on the joke or the idea or the concept entirely?
Yeah, absolutely. I think some of these comics, they have jokes, like they have a joke concept that, it takes them a bunch of time to actually get the whole thing right. Or, they workshop like parts of a big set in different ways. They have to like flesh out parts. They have to like figure out how it crafts together. And then, what you actually see in the Netflix special is a result of, years of getting out there every night and doing small shows. Great. I'll definitely include a link to that for the audience in the show notes. Where can listeners best follow your thoughts on software development online? So I'm mostly on Twitter. Like Twitter is even better than email for me because like email, I don't know. Like I don't know if this happens to you, Robby, but I get like 20 emails a day from people trying to sell me things. Yeah. So Twitter is where to find me. Excellent. Well, it's been such a delight to have you join us on Maintainable, Jean. Thank you so much for talking shop with us. Yeah, thank you so much. This was super fun.